irritation. And this is an example of that. Polychlorinated biphenyls is an example of acne forming or acne hazard type of chemical. Ingestion, as we mentioned, is the third most common route of exposure. And it's not often that we have people just go out and say, well, I'm going to eat this chemical or drink this solvent. Although there have been crazy cases where that's been the case. But we do have the opportunity to have ingestion by primarily not practicing good personal hygiene. We go out and we handle chemicals, and it gets on our hands or clothing, and then we go and we eat or smoke or through contact with our mouth can ingest that chemical into the body at low concentrations, but enough to cause damage. And then finally, injection is the final route of exposure. Again, this is usually occurred by puncturing the skin with sharp objects. We see a lot of it in needle sticks in medical facilities. But you can also have puncture to the skin by using tools and products that could be contaminated with stuff. As far as the toxic action of chemicals, we've got two primary means of toxic action. One is acute action or acute exposure, also referred to as acute response. Acute meaning sharpened means it's usually exposure to a high concentration of a material, and it's occurring over a short period of time. So it's a high dose very quickly, and the response is usually going to be relatively soon, either immediately or within a matter of hours. The most common acute exposures occur when we have an accidental spill, or say a pipeline breaks, or something occurs where we suddenly get a high concentration of material that causes the response. Some of the immediate responses that we detect from acute exposures are going to be dizziness, pulmonary edema, which is just inflammation of fluids in the pulmonary tract system, respiratory distress, difficulty breathing, and so on. Usually acute exposures are from a single exposure, one-time event. Once the exposure discontinues, the symptoms go away. There's usually no long-term health effect, provided you didn't die from it. But you get out of the exposure, your body recovers, it heals itself, there's no long-lasting damage. Chronic exposure, on the other hand, is just the opposite. It's where typically we're exposed over long periods of time, months, years, and it's exposure to low concentrations of material. So we can be exposed to that low concentrations and really not notice any kind of effect. Initially, maybe we did. Initially, we might have noted a little headache or awful smelly stuff type of thing, but our body adapted to it and got used to it. And so then we continue to be exposed day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year. And down the road, over a long period of time, which is usually referred to as a latency period, the symptoms start developing. And for chronic exposures, once the symptoms begin developing, it's usually irreversible. The damage has been done, and we can't change it. And so that's one of the difficult problems the industrial hygienist has, or the challenges, is to convince employees that damage could be taking place to their body by being exposed to these low concentrations. Now, be it an acute exposure or a chronic exposure, the industrial hygiene has to look at both with equal significance of importance to the overall exposure of our workers and for the benefit of our employers. Some of the examples of chronic hazards that can result are development of cataracts, liver kidney damage, or dermatitis, respiratory tract damage, various cancers that can occur, and so on. As I mentioned, the latency period is basically the time period from exposure and the development of the symptoms. And those latencies periods can vary. For asbestos, it can be 20 to 30 years following your exposure. For benzene and exposure and the causation of leukemia, it may take 15 years before we note it. One of the things that we often do in the field of toxicology in trying to identify whether a material is toxic or not is to utilize what is referred to as retrospective studies. And retrospective studies are basically those studies that occur when we see a high incidence of a particular adverse health effect in a certain type of worker who's been handling or around or working with a certain chemical. For example, we saw leukemia develop when in benzene workers, and those people who are exposed to benzene. We saw various cancers formed from vinyl chloride workers because we had a high incidence of cancer in vinyl chloride workers. And that throws up a red flag, and hence the investigation in a retrospective study takes place, which basically means it's after the fact. The illness has already occurred. Some of the influencing factors that affect the toxicity of material, number one is the concentration. Secondly is the duration and frequency of exposures, or in other words, how long. Our total dose is going to be a function of concentration times duration. A route of exposure, route of entry, can have an impact. Interspecies variation as well as intraspecies variation. What we're referring to here, there are some chemicals out there that can impact men and maybe not impact women. There are example of scrotal cancer being caused by soot. You know, that's a male generated toxicant. We can have some compounds out there that will affect women and won't affect men. We can also have certain chemicals out there, depending on your genetic makeup, your ethnic makeup, that it will cause damage to certain ethnic classifications that won't cause it to other ethnic classifications. We also have environmental factors that can influence the toxicity of materials, as well as the combination of chemical substances. As far as intraspecies variation, age and maturity, when we talk about toxic chemicals, most of the studies are geared at identifying the dangers to a normal, healthy adult person. And so it's difficult to apply the toxicological information that we learn from these studies to young kids, infants, and children who are developing. Their organs are just developing and growing, and so a substance that may not harm a mature adult individual could very well be a strong enough concentration to cause an adverse health effect to an infant. On the other end of the spectrum, very old people, as we age, our body organs and the functions of our body organs start to deteriorate as they get old. They wear out. And so a concentration that doesn't affect a normal, healthy adult could very well cause damage to somebody who is elderly because their body organs have already been stressed or taxed to a certain degree. And as I mentioned, we've got genetic makeups that can be a problem as far as just a general individual's state of health. As I mentioned, a phenomenon as far as interaction of chemicals, we have synergistic, potentiation, and antagonistic. Synergistic means when I'm exposed to a single chemical, it can do damage to me. When I'm exposed to a second chemical alone by itself, it can do damage to my body. But when I'm exposed to both of them at the same time, it's not an additive effect of damage, it's a multiplicative effect. It can be several times more dangerous. The best classical illustration of this is asbestos exposure and cigarette smoking. Done independently, each one of them, they have a certain degree of hazard that they can create. But when you have it together, add them together, it's not twice as bad. Studies have shown it can be anywhere from 80 to 200 times more likely of an individual developing a disease from that. Potentiation means we've got the two chemicals, chemical A and chemical B, each alone. Chemical A could be fairly toxic. Chemical B is not very toxic at all, very low in order of toxicity. But when you do them together, chemical B makes chemical A much worse. It accentuates the problem. A good example of this we had to deal with in the military. We did a lot of solvent cleaning with trichloroethylene, TCE, and it in itself is a central nervous system depressant. So workers would be exposed to it a little bit. And then after work, they'd go to the Airmen's Club or a bar and have a beer, and the ethyl alcohol is rated as fairly low toxicity, but having a single beer kicked in and made the exposure to the TCE that much worse, and people would respond by looking like they were totally wiped out, drunk, just from a single beer. And that's an example of a potentiation. And then you can have antagonists. Antagonists are where you got two chemicals, each individually can cause damage, but when you do them together, they counteract each other or negate each other, and that's how we treat lead, or used to treat lead poisoning. Is if somebody had lead poisoning, you administer a chelating agent, which that would counteract the adverse effects of lead poisoning. Again, when we talk concentrations of materials, I mentioned what we're referring to as mass per unit volume, and it can be expressed as either milligrams per cubic meter, micrograms per cubic meter, or nanograms, as referred here. Other terms of concentration are parts per million, parts per billion, parts per trillion. Here's some examples of what those concepts mean. Oftentimes you'll find people misinterpret these terms in the opposite of what they are telling us. A person, if you tell them it's parts per million, if you tell somebody it's parts per billion, they think that's a lot more because billion is a lot. And you have to explain to them, no, it's parts of the substance per billion parts of air or million parts of air. So once you get down to parts per trillion, that's a pretty small pretty small quantity. In toxicology, one of the things they look at is what are the chances of death by 1 part per million exposures that increase that chance, or reduced life expectancy by 8 minutes. Here's just a few listed some examples of conditions that will create those types of criteria. Smoking, living 2 months with a smoker, eating, and so on. Once we have deposition of chemicals into the body, this graph kind of shows you the flow. If it comes in through the digestive tract, it goes down in the gastrointestinal tract. From there, it could either go out through the feces, or it can go into the liver and the other biological systems and either do damage, maybe eventually eliminated through urine. If it's through inhalation, it can come into the lungs, again get into the blood and lymph systems, be transferred to the other body organs. Dermal contact can get into the blood system and do impact. Just kind of an illustration of how chemical transport can take place. This is just a table of some of the exposure effects of different chemicals, what you can find. Some of the terms, when we talk about chemical hazards, one of the terms that we frequently encounter is asphyxiants. And when we talk about asphyxiants, it's a chemical that basically is going to interfere with the body receiving the oxygen that it needs to support body tissue and death. And eventually, if the asphyxiant is high enough concentration, it can lead to death through starvation of oxygen. Now, on asphyxiants, we have two types, simple asphyxiant and chemical asphyxiant. A simple asphyxiant is one where there's just basically a physiologically inert gas goes in. It either dilutes or displaces the presence of oxygen, and as a result of that, starves the body from being able to receive the necessary oxygen allotment that it needs. A chemical asphyxiant is where a chemical will go into the body and interfere with the body's ability to intake oxygen. A good example of this is carbon monoxide, because carbon monoxide has a greater affinity for hemoglobin than oxygen does. And you inhale carbon monoxide, it binds up on the hemoglobin, and that, as a result of that, oxygen doesn't get transported throughout the body. So that's a chemical asphyxiant. Here's some examples of simple asphyxiants. Again, your inert gases. A lot of these are inert. And then you get into chemical asphyxiants, carbon monoxide, hydrogen sulfide, methylene chloride, hydrogen cyanide. We can also have chemicals that cause central nervous system depressants. It's basically, it interferes with the functions of the brain and spinal cord and all the peripheral neural nerves associated with that. They're basically depressants. So examples can be your alcohols, ketones, ethers, aromatics, halogenated hydrocarbons. A lot of the central nervous system depressants we used to use as anesthetics. In some cases, your anesthetics are a central nervous system depressant. That's how they function. And we do it under controlled conditions to where it doesn't cause damage to the body. Another type of toxin that we can encounter are what's referred to as neurotoxins, and those are substances that will impact the nervous system, peripheral nerves. And majority of the neurotoxins are oftentimes metals. Lead and mercury, example, you may recall in in Alice in Wonderland, the character of the Mad Hatter. That's because in England they would use mercury to treat felt hats, and they would rub it on with their hands, and mercury would be absorbed through the skin, and those hat workers would become crazy, insane, and hence the term of the Mad Hatter. So there's a number of illustrations and cases of mercury or central nervous system or neurotoxins. Where you see here a professor of chemistry died in a year because of his exposure to mercury. Acetylcholinesterase are chemicals that can inhibit the cholinesterase in the body and have a nervous system impact. A lot of your pesticides are like that. When we deal with liver toxins, it's referred to hepatotoxins, or capable of damaging the liver. There's a variety of organic substances that can go in and do damage. And typically when you see damage done to the liver, you're also going to see it done to the kidneys. And for kidneys, though, we refer to them as nephrotoxins. And like the liver, the kidneys are a major metabolic processing site. And these chemicals that can do damage there come in, and the kidneys are trying to, much like the liver, trying to process it to either get it out of the body or change it into something less toxic. And in the process, it causes damage to that the kidney function. We have certain chemicals that are referred to as cardiac sensitizers, can impact the heart, the rhythmic of the heart. Pulmonary hazards, respiratory hazards, we've already gone over this list. And then we can have carcinogens, chemicals that are capable of causing cancer are referred to as carcinogens. It's an abnormal cell growth, produces tumors or oncogens or blastomogens. They're all cancers. The definition of cancer is basically a substance that will produce a malignant tumor or growth in humans following a reasonable exposure, or a substance that will induce neoplastic new and abnormal growth in any tissue of any animal and in any dose by any method of application. A substance that produces cancer in 2 or greater animal species. That's what a definition by NIOSH is. Types of carcinogens, you can have radiation, benzene, both capable of causing leukemia. You have mycotoxins such as aflatoxins, trichothecenes, etc. Vinyl chloride, which causes a rare form of liver cancer. Bis-chloromethyl ether, BCME, which causes is referred to as Hutzel carcinoma of the lungs. Mutagens. Mutagens are those chemical substances that can cause damage to the genetic system in males and females, and as a result, they may not be show any damage or harm, but their offspring will show the damage, and oftentimes they'll have their offspring born as with mutation, various types of mutations, and it's very difficult for the toxicologists to study these things because of the latency periods associated with it. Below there you can see some of the various stages of development of where reproductive hazards can occur, all through various phases of mutagens. Teratogens, on the other hand, are those chemical compounds that will do damage when exposed directly to the fetus. So pregnant women if they're exposed to these particular chemicals, those chemicals that go in most likely won't bother the mother, but will harm the fetus. And it makes it very difficult when we have pregnant women in certain areas of the workforce that could have potential exposure. We have to make accommodations to remove those out of those exposures. And then, again, a teratogen is where the fetus or the infant, when it's born, will have various mutations associated with it. As I mentioned, we have restrictions of females working in certain industries when they are pregnant. This is just a table. It's hard to read here on this slide. It's a table just showing different principles or mechanisms of toxicity. And obviously, when we do studies in toxicology, we can't study every chemical. So frequently what we do is that they'll study a particular chemical, and then if a second chemical or other chemicals have similar chemical structures, then they'll apply those exposure standards to those chemical substances that have not been, fortunately, to be studied. Primarily what we like to do is do animal experiments to determine the acceptable standard or exposure limit. Unfortunately, it is very costly. It takes lots of time to do, and you're always using a test species that you hope will resemble a human response, but you're not 100% guaranteed that it will. So there are some problems associated with animal studies. However, it's very difficult to get humans to participate in toxicology studies. Certain studies for acute exposures or reactions you can do on humans, but for those studies that are going to look at death, carcinogens, stuff like this, you have to rely on the animal studies. And then what you have to do is try to convert that experimental data that you come up with into an exposure from a human standpoint. So how long are they, if you have a response at this level, how long are you exposed to? Oftentimes on human epidemiology, which is the study of the incidence and distribution of diseases in the population, and conditions that will influence the spread and severity of diseases, you have retrospective studies, which is, as I mentioned earlier, you review historical data and you see incidences where you might have a response from a particular chemical. Or you can do prospective studies, and that's where you collect data ongoing and assess that data. Some examples of retrospective studies are beryllium data that's been accumulated in the 40s and the 50s, asbestos data in the 30s to 50s, and some example of prospective studies are Brush-Wellman, who currently does exposure studies on beryllium, and also NIOSH, who's always doing studies on exposure data for preparation of intelligent bulletins and criteria documents. This is just a table that shows various inhalation exposure limits. You've got permissible exposure limits, which are an OSHA criteria, recommended exposure limits from NIOSH. ACGIH has threshold limit values. AIHA has workplace exposure levels, wheels. Environmental Protection Agency has new chemical exposure limits. In Germany, they use the maximum allowable concentration, and so on, some of the other countries and some of the terms that they use. Again, you can find various tables that show toxicity classifications, and depending on what you're looking for, what types of hazards you're trying to define, you can go to those various tables and resources to get toxicity ratings. Okay, the last subject that we have to talk about today, we need to move right into it because of our time, is going to be regulations. Regulations and standards. We'll start with, got a lot of acronyms that we hear used and banded around in our professional careers. And some of those terms, like OSHA, stands for the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, or ACT. And it is basically a set of regulation that governs workplace and employee safety. Then you have TSCA, which, as you may know, is the Toxic Substance Control Act. Basically, TSCA regulates chemicals from cradle to grave. It is the all-inclusive act. There's only a limited number of chemicals that have been regulated by TSCA: asbestos, PCBs, toxins, to name a few. But it totally can govern the life of a chemical from the point of inception to when you thought about it, to manufacturing, to distribution and disposal. Then you have RCRA, Resource Conservation Recovery Act. This is basically the regulations that regulate hazardous waste cradle to grave concept. We have CERCLA, which is the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation Liability Act, or Superfund. This act was basically, came into being after Love Canal and events such as the Valley of the Drums in New Jersey, where we had a lot of chemical hazardous waste materials being disposed of or emptied out into our environment uncontrolled, and it started getting into our ecosystem and causing damage to the population, the general public. And we had these sites that needed to be cleaned up, but we didn't have the resources, money to do it. So Congress passed CERCLA to enable to fund the cleanup of these places, and in the meantime, they would try to pursue the responsible parties for those cleanups, and eventually set the wheels in motion to do this cleanup. We got FIFRA, which is the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, Rodenticide Act. It basically regulates our pesticide. Then you have SARA, which is the Superfund Amendment Reauthorization Act. I just mentioned when that CERCLA came out, it put in some funds to clean up these messes. Well, those funds got used up, and we still had messes to clean up. And so Congress had to go and amend the Superfund Amendment, or the Superfund Act, and so they came up with the Superfund Amendment Reauthorization Act, which refunded CERCLA monies. But in doing so, as congressmen typically like to do, they put some riders on that amended act, and a couple of the significant riders that were attached were SARA Title III, which is our community right to know. That was basically an offshoot or a result of Bhopal and the release of toxic gases that killed thousands of people, injured thousands of people. And so it set out some laws that said in the United States, you in your communities need to come up with preparedness plans, contingency plans on what to do in the event of a toxic material release. They also address the hazardous waste emergency response safety. Interesting enough, what this particular part of the act did was it told OSHA, you need to develop a safety and health standard to protect hazardous waste operators and emergency response personnel, because their workplace exposures are totally different than a normal workplace. So this is the first time that an EPA regulation came out and told OSHA, you need to pass a regulation on this subject. And as a result of that, that regulation was one of the easiest regulations to get through the promulgation process for OSHA. There was also some rules and regulations on underground storage tanks And the SARA amendment talked about funding some indoor air quality studies to address indoor air quality problems. MSHA is the Mine Safety and Health Administration, which regulates mining activities. HMTA is the Hazardous Materials Transportation Act under the Department of Transportation. It's going to basically regulate your chemicals that are transported by highway or airplanes or over the water or rail systems. And then you finally can get into local and state rules as well that have an impact on regulations. But what we want to do is spend a little more depth, going in depth with the OSHA regulations, because from an industrial hygiene and safety standpoint, these are probably the more prominent regulations that we deal with in a day-to-day professional activity. As I had mentioned, the Act was passed in 1970. The agency was formed in 1971. The agency was placed under the Department of Labor, and the ultimate purpose or goal of OSHA was to provide a safe and healthy work environment for all employees. Now, the regulations, there are several different sections of regulations, and here I've listed 3 of them. Note, first of all, 29 CFR 1910. To explain what this means is 29 is the section for the Department of Labor. So we're talking about the Department of Labor rule and regulation, and CFR is Code of Federal Regulation. And then 1910 are the safety and health standards for general industry. You can also have 1926, which is construction industry, 1915, maritime standards. In a moment, when we go into the OSHA regulations, I'll show you all the others. Now, when OSHA developed standards, they came up with different types of standards. They were design standards, which are used for like ventilation, that say, here is how you design this system. They're very specific, almost engineering-oriented type of standards. Then you have performance standards, which are what employers prefer. It basically gives the employer the flexibility of how to do it. The performance standard says you will do this, but they don't tell you how you have to do it. So they give a lot of latitude to individual employers of how they go about complying with that standard. Then you have vertical standards, and vertical standards are those regulations that apply to one specific industry. And we'll see some of those when we look at the OSHA page in shortly a little bit. And then you have horizontal standard. A horizontal standard refers to a standard that applies to all industry. I don't care what you do. General industry, construction, maritime, this standard applies. Now, OSHA conducts inspections. That's one of their key roles. And the things that can trigger an inspection are first and foremost are fatalities or multiple hospitalization. Anytime there's a fatality, OSHA is going to investigate it. Or anytime there's a hospitalization of 5 or more workers, I think is the number that you use, then OSHA is going to investigate. The second type of inspection would be an imminent danger situation. And that can be instituted either by the compliance officers seeing an imminent danger situation and just stopping and conducting an inspection, or in some cases with the whistleblower program, you can have people who call in who see what they believe is an imminent danger situation, call into OSHA, and OSHA can do an inspection as a result of that. You can also have inspections that have been a result of an employee complaint. Now, the OSHA law protects employees against any adverse action if they file a complaint regarding safety and health work conditions to OSHA. Now, the complainant can remain anonymous to the employer. However, they have to reveal their identity to OSHA, so OSHA can verify that they truly are an employee of that particular company. Another type of inspection is based on high hazard industry. Every year, OSHA publishes, based on injury and illness data that has been accumulated, those industries that are classified as high hazard. And they will target those industries for inspections. And then you could have a follow-up inspection. Anytime OSHA comes out and inspects you and they find a serious or multiple serious violations, then typically that will trigger a follow-up inspection to make sure that you have, as the employer, corrected the problem. And then finally, OSHA can conduct just routine inspections by going down various lists of identities of various companies. The types of citations that can occur or be issued by OSHA are the most serious would be criminal, but that would be triggered by a willful violation. And a willful violation is where the employer knows that they're violating a standard, yet they go ahead and expose employees to it, and an employee becomes injured or dies from that. That's a willful violation. There haven't been a lot, hopefully, thankfully, of those types of violations, but they have occurred. The next type of violation and citation that can be issued is serious. A serious is where any violation that, as a result of that violation, an employee can experience, doesn't have to, but could experience serious injury or death or illness from a violation of the standard. A non-serious is a violation of the standard. However, because of that violation, it's not going to cause serious physical harm or danger to that worker. And a de minimis violation is where you have, it's a violation of the standard, but it's more of a paperwork type of violation. It's not a type of violation that will impact an employee's safety and health. And that de minimis might be an example of a record-keeping error or something like that. Then you can also have citations for failure to abate, report, or maintain records. And then dependent on the type of citation that OSHA issues, they can also issue penalties to the employers for those violations. For a willful or serious violations, you're talking upwards to $10,000 per violation per incident. For non-serious, it can go $1,000 to $3,000. So the severity of the penalty is going to be equally equated to the severity of the violation that has occurred. As I mentioned, when OSHA went out to develop standards, they went out and they adopted consensus standards, which at the time were ideal standards, and all of a sudden OSHA made them into minimum standards, and that kind of ticked off a lot of employers. But we eventually got over it, and it is what it is today. For the health hazards, OSHA adopted the ACGIH 1968 TLV booklet. This is an example of a TLV book. This is the 2012 edition of the TLV booklet, but that's what the TLV booklet looks like. And inside, we'll look at it in a little bit. You've got various threshold limit values for chemical substances. A copy of a TLV booklet is also contained in your fundamentals book, which we'll look at again in a little bit. Well, OSHA adopted the ACGIH TLV booklet from 1968. which at that time was a fairly new version of TLVs. However, it's now 2012, which is over 40 plus years old, and we're still using the 1968 TLVs. Well, there have been a lot of studies, toxicological studies, with respect to chemical hazards over the last 40 years. And the the current ACGIH TLV booklet is totally different from that 1968 version. It's much more up to date. But OSHA cannot just automatically adopt a new booklet. They have to go through a rulemaking process for implementing new standards. And that rulemaking process can be quite complex. Here's the process of how it works. First of all, you have to publish a request for information if you're trying to find out about a particular issue. And you then have to publish an advance notice of proposed rulemaking. In other words, we go out and we tell everybody, hey, we're going to make a rule on this subject. And then you request public comment, and you give them about 30 to 60 days to submit their comments. You evaluate those comments. In some cases, you may have a public hearing to discuss those comments. And then you have a post-hearing comment period, following 30 days following the hearing. And then eventually, OSHA will issue a final rule with approximately 90 days to take effect. While that may sound like a streamlined process, it has never worked that fast. It has taken literally OSHA years to develop new standards because of all the comments and resistance of developing those new standards. Now, once the standard has been developed or finalized, it can also be challenged in the appellate court by various parties, unions, industry representatives, and so on. And oftentimes that happens. It delays the process even longer. Now, in Arizona, OSHA enforces the program. And all states are given the opportunity to enforce their own OSHA rules and regulations. Some states have chosen to do that, Arizona being one of them. Other states have chosen not to. Leave it to the federal government and let them fund it. It won't tax our budget and so on. If a state does choose to enforce their own program, the federal government will fund that program, 50%, I believe it is, of the operating costs for that program. Now, in Arizona, which is typically a state that likes to do everything on its own, chose to do that. And they developed the Arizona Division of Occupational Safety and Health, which is ADOSH. And so in Arizona, if you have an OSHA issue, with a few exceptions, you would go to ADOSH to address those issues. I mentioned earlier that NIOSH was formulated at the same time that OSHA was. And NIOSH's role was to provide research, provide education, recommend new standards to OSHA, conduct respiratory certification approvals and stuff. So they're more of a research educational agency. They are located in the Department of Health and Human Services, and they do conduct all of these tasks that are listed here. Other health and safety organizations, again, a lot of these are professional organizations, but they have some kind of impact or influence on the industrial hygiene field, is the American Industrial Hygiene Association, AIHA, nonprofit professional organization, ASSE, American Society of Safety Engineers, also a nonprofit professional organization, the American National Standards Institute, which will develop ANSI standards, again, a non-regulatory agency, but more of a supported consensus standard development group. And then you've got the American Conference of Governmental Industrial Hygienists, ACGIH, which develops their standards. Well, with respect to OSHA, the OSHA health standards are referred to as permissible exposure limits, PELs. And the PELs can come in some specific forms. The first being a time-weighted average, PEL. That is basically the airborne concentration which should not be exceeded in an 8-hour day, 40-hour work week. This is actual a legal requirement. If OSHA comes out and does an inspection, they're going to do air samples, and they're going to compare their results with the PEL of that particular chemical. That chemical may also have a, quote, maximum concentration which should never be exceeded. And that's referred to as a PEL ceiling value. The ceiling value means you're never allowed to go above this limit, supposedly even instantaneously. However, OSHA went on to say in their, because they adopted the old TLV booklet, it's 1968, it said you're allowed to go above the ceiling if you meet this criteria. And so they have concentrations of a few substances that will allow you to go above the TWA and the ceiling, which you can do it for a short period of time, and I'll show you in a minute how those are written. But those are acceptable, referred to as acceptable excursions above the PEL. Now, ACGIH, they utilize the TLV concept, which is threshold limit value. They also have an 8-hour time-weighted average, and they define it as the concentration for an 8-hour workday and a 40-hour work week, which nearly all workers may be repeatedly exposed day after day without adverse health effects. Notice the terminology may be, which nearly all workers may be repeatedly exposed to. That they do that because there may be people out there that are sensitive that could respond to the exposure limit they're listed. And so they kind of put that gray area in there. Then you have a ceiling value, which again, just like OSHA, the TLV ceiling is the maximum concentration. You should never be exceeded. And they also have an excursion. But now this excursion concept has changed to what is referred to as a STEL, which is a short-term exposure limit. And that's the maximum concentrations workers can be exposed to for a 15-minute period, allowed 4 excursions per day, with 60 minutes between each excursion, and an 8-hour time-weighted average must not be exceeded. Well, let's take a look at the OSHA standards, first of all. If you go to the OSHA website, it's www.osha.gov, and it'll bring you to this page. And actually, it's a pretty informative page, or website that OSHA has. You've got reference materials that you can call upon. They have various tools, various training systems that are available here. So it's an excellent website to go to. But if we went to the regulations, we would pull up the regulations, and you could go down through the list of regulations that we've got here. Well, the regulation that we want to look at is 1910.1000, and that lists our PELs. So if I go down and I pull up 1910.1000, I will get the PELs. And there's 3 tables of PELs. The first one is a listing here It's the limits for air concentration. It's alphabetically listed. It'll list the chemical CAS number, and then it'll list what the 8-hour time-weighted average is, and in parts per million and milligrams per cubic meter. And you can convert back and forth between them for gases and vapors. Now, if it was a sealing concentration, it would have a C in front of it, like we see here. Otherwise, it's for an 8-hour exposure. Now, over here in the skin designation, you will see some materials with an X. That means that particular material can have a body burden by skin exposure. In other words, that chemical can penetrate through the skin and get into the body and contribute to the damage. So what you need to do is look at this table, read through the footnotes to get an understanding. Now there's a second table, table Z2, and this is the excursion table where I mentioned it says, okay, don't go above, this is your 8-hour time-weighted average. This is your ceiling level, which is 25. But we'll let you go above that for 10 minutes up to, but not greater than 50 parts per million. So this was the old STEL concept, has since gone by the wayside through the TLV booklet. But since it was promulgated in 1968 and it hasn't gone through a rulemaking change process, we still have that on the books. And then there's the third table on dust and minerals. Here we've got, first of all, listing for crystalline silica because of its dangers. What we have here is a formula to determine what the acceptable exposure limit is. They don't give us a fixed number. They tell us, depending on the concentration or percentage of free silica, will depend on what your acceptable exposure limit is. So we have to use a formula to determine what the acceptable exposure limit is. Well, next week, or our next class meeting, I'll show you how to work that formula. And then for other mineral dust, it has specific numbers. For respirable fraction, it's 5 milligrams. For total dust, it's 15 milligrams. So those are your OSHA standards, OSHA regulations. And I said you can go to the table of contents and you can see in all the different OSHA regulations or guidelines that they have established here, which may have an impact on you. So to go into that website, you need to become familiar with it and how to utilize it. So that's the OSHA health standards. The ACGIA booklet, a version of it is contained in your book under page 919, I believe it is. Actually, if you flip to, it starts on page 919, but if you flip to page, starting on page 934, it looks like, we will see the OSHA, or an example of a TLV booklet in our book. And in the problems that you work in on your project, you want to use the TLV booklet that's in the book. If you've got the newer version of the 2012, that's good. And you may use that in your day-to-day operations. But you need to use the TLV guideline that's in the book to work your project. The reason being is because when it goes through the grading process, it's going to look for the number that's in the book. And if that number has changed from the current TLV booklet to what it is in the book, then you're going to miss the question. So again, it'll list alphabetically the name of the chemical, the time-weighted average exposure, the STEL, any kind of footnote, notes available. It gives you the molecular weight, and it also gives you the basic target organs that can be affected by the particular chemical. So that's an example of the TLV booklet that's in your book. And if you look at the new version of a TLV booklet, you will see it's identical. It's just that this current booklet will have updated TLVs compared to the one that's in your book. But for this, we are going to use the book TLV when we talk about that. Again, in the TLV booklet, it'll have a skin notation, which means that the chemical can contribute through skin absorption. As far as its toxicity, it has a ceiling notation. It will have a C before the number. It has 3 appendices that you need to look at, A1, 2, and 3. Now, other exposure limit guidelines, the OSHA standard is law. The TLV booklet and TLVs are recommended standards. So are these others. These other are recommended exposure limits based on current research and current literature on the hazards of these chemicals. They're general guidelines. The ANSI has acceptable concentration. ACGIH, TLVs. AIHA has the WHEEL guidelines, workplace exposure guidelines. NIOSH has the RELs, recommended exposure limits. And you got your OSHA standard. Again, this is our OSHA dose response. Exposure is the amount of chemical substance to which a given organism is exposed, expressed in parts per million for gases and vapors, milligrams per cubic meter for solids. Gases and vapors can also be expressed in milligrams per cubic meter. Solids will not be expressed as parts per million. That's important to note. When we talk about absorbed doses on toxicology, it's milligrams of the contaminant substance versus the kilogram of body weight. Again, we looked at the OSHA PELs, they're subpart Z, 1910-1000. We've adopted the 1968 TLVs. The PELs are really out of date. I really recommend that if you're doing any work or recommendations, that you use the guidelines and available reference materials you have through NIOSH, ACGIH's current TLV booklet and stuff, and use those, because the old TLVs that are OSHA, being enforced by OSHA, many of them are out of date, and as a result, if you comply with them, you could be exposing workers to dangerous levels of chemicals. But the PELs are the only ones that have the force of law. There are specific standards that are out there that OSHA has promulgated, and you'll find those in the 1910-1000 series. Some are like asbestos, formaldehyde, methyl chloride, lead, benzene, chrome, and so on. And they'll have their individual exposure limits in those individual substance standards. We talked about the Toxic Substance Control Act. It's basically EPA requiring businesses to establish standards for chemicals that they're going to produce, develop the health and safety data before it's introduced into commerce, so on. EPA has some carcinogen classification criteria. Class A is a known human carcinogen. Class B1 is a probable human carcinogen, which has been supported by epidemiologic study. B2 is probable human carcinogen based on animal study. Class C is a possible human carcinogen. Class D is non-classifiable human carcinogen, and E is no evidence of the material being a carcinogen. RTEX, basically, OSHA requires the Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare to publish a list of all known toxic substances within 6 months of passage of the OSHA Act, and periodically, at least annually. So every year, RTEX publishes the latest data on the hazards of all chemicals and substances that are introduced into the environment. NIOSH, as I mentioned, does the recommended exposure limits. They do their studies, and they'll come back and recommend to OSHA, this is what your PEL should be, and they recommend they change it. However, it doesn't get done very often. NIOSH also publishes criteria documents and intelligence bulletins on the hazards of certain chemicals and chemical processes and or safety problems. I mentioned the ACGIH TLBs. The first meeting was in 1938 in Washington. By 1941, they had a committee that developed chemical substance exposures. By 1946, they changed to the American Conference of Governmental Industrial Hygienists and opened memberships to IHs in government and academia. Here's an example of a TLB booklet. This particular one was published in 1963. As far as the ACGIH policy, they'll publish threshold limit values and biological exposure indices as guidelines to assist us in the control of health hazards. Biological exposure indices are, for particular chemicals, you can do blood work or urine tests or saliva tests and determine if your body has an overexposure to that chemical. Those biological indexes have been established through study. And so there's a few chemicals that have a BEI that you can administer to workers to see if there's been an exposure or not. Again, the TLBs and BEIs are all recommendations and guidelines. They can't be enforced as law. They're not a legal standard, and they're guidelines. And so that's how they have to be used and interpreted. Talked about these are their guides. However, I strongly urge you to use them as a guide. Okay, again, you'll have some a project where you'll need to go and look up PELs and TLBs and OSHA standards. To look up the PELs, you need to go to the website, OSHA.gov, and go to the section 1910-1000 and use the PELs that are listed in it to do your identification. There'll be questions on the exam that will have you look those values up as well. So the final thing I want to do today, before we end, is just give you an idea of what kind of questions will be on the test, so you know how to study. The test is going to be primarily, as best I can, matching or multiple choice. There are a few questions that are short answer, that there's just no way for me to identify if you understand the material other than providing a short answer. But the rest of them I've tried to make, put in the form of matching and multiple choice. Now, when you select, just like on your projects, if you're doing a multiple choice, there may be two answers that seem pretty good. And what you want to do is pick out which one's the best. And there is definitely one that will distinguish itself from the other. So don't just hurriedly go through and say, oh, this looks right, and mark it. Definitely evaluate the entire question and entire answers. So things you ought to do. You'll have a matching question that define permissible exposure limits, TLBs, sealing concentrations, short-term exposure limits. So you'll need to know those definitions. You also have matching questions for definitions no, toxicity, hazard, acute exposure, and chronic exposure in LD and LC50. You'll need to know the different forms of chemical dermatitis. You'll need to know the routes of entry. A short answer, you'll need to describe the OSHA and NIOSH agencies and what their major roles and responsibilities are. There are 2 slides in the presentations today that cover that. And then you'll need to be able to define industrial hygiene, list the key words and stresses, the key stresses, and explain what they are. You'll have matching questions on the various toxicological terms: asphyxiant, mutagen, nephrotoxin, fibrosis, teratogens, hepatotoxin, hemopoietic, which I don't know if I mentioned that. Hemopoietic is a toxin that affects the blood, like benzene. Synergistic, neurotoxin, carcinogen. Be able to define gases, vapors, dust, fumes, mist, and then be able to look up exposure limits, PELs, and then know the difference of what a respirable fraction dust particle is. So those are basically what questions are going to be on your exam. So it'll help you to study and prepare. So with that ends our lecture material for today's session. Our next session will be in 2 weeks. It will again be on a Friday. So I encourage you to have your projects completed before you take your examination. I will try to get your projects graded as quickly as possible. And with that, we'll see you next time.